The weight of life experience is not something one notices when they are young. In youth, the world feels like a series of open doors and endless possibilities. Mistakes are often invisible, pain is temporary, and consequences are abstract. But as time moves forward, the illusions of invulnerability fade. Life begins to accumulate in the psyche like layers of sediment, pressing down, shaping the contours of consciousness in ways that are invisible yet impossible to ignore. Every failure, every betrayal, every misjudgment leaves a mark not just in memory, but in the architecture of who a person becomes. Experience is not neutral. It is a relentless teacher. The sharp edge of disappointment, the sting of unmet expectations, the exhaustion of repeated effort without immediate reward. These are the elements that carve the psyche into something capable of true insight. Those who have avoided discomfort, who have insulated themselves from challenge, often retain only a superficial sense of self. They know theory, they can recite principles, they can appear enlightened, but they have not been tempered by reality. True mastery, the kind that emerges only after decades, is forged in the crucible of unrelenting experience. There is a particular quality to accumulated experience that cannot be simulated. Books, philosophies, or teachings may point toward understanding, but without the lived encounter with life's unpredictability, knowledge remains inert. The person who has endured loss, who has faced the collapse of relationships, who has confronted their own moral failures and still stood upright, develops a kind of internal gravity. Their decisions are not light, impulsive, or reactive. They carry the weight of precedent, the lessons learned through repeated confrontation with the harsh truths of existence. This weight does not crush, it steadies. Time also reveals patterns that are invisible in youth. Early failures may seem chaotic, random, or unfair. But decades later, the same mistakes, the same betrayals, the same recurring themes in human behavior begin to make sense. Life reveals its cycles, and the individual begins to recognize the subtleties of cause and effect in human character, in relationships, in society. This awareness is not merely intellectual, it is somatic, embedded in the body and mind through repeated exposure to consequence. The over 5-0 consciousness understands the long arc of action and consequence, the invisible laws that govern human interaction, and the cost of ignoring them. Experience also teaches the limits of control. Younger people often believe mastery comes from external achievement, success, wealth, influence, recognition. Life experience demonstrates with brutal consistency that control is often illusory. The world is indifferent to desire and intention. Only by confronting this indifference, by facing repeated failure and disappointment, does a person begin to cultivate the internal locus of control that is central to true self-mastery. They learn to distinguish what they can influence from what must be endured, and in that distinction lies a quiet, unshakable power. Moreover, life experience shapes the emotional landscape. Joy, grief, regret, and contentment are not abstract concepts. They are forces that over time test and refine character. The person who has faced betrayal, grief, or profound loss develops a capacity for empathy, patience, and understanding that is impossible to fabricate. But this empathy is not sentimental. It is hard-won. It is the product of surviving the emotional weight that would have crushed those unprepared. Only with decades of experience can the individual calibrate compassion without compromising judgment, generosity without naivete, and engagement without being consumed. The weight of life experience is also a mirror of mortality. By midlife, the awareness of time's limits begins to sharpen. Every decision carries a shadow of consequence, not just for the present, but for the remaining span of life. This awareness changes priorities, sharpens perception, and forces the psyche to reckon with what truly matters. One cannot maintain superficial desires, trivial ambitions, or ego-driven illusions when the awareness of finitude presses in. Experience, in this sense, is a kind of discipline, it forces alignment between inner truth and outer action. Finally, this weight transforms perception itself. The person who has carried the burden of decades sees beneath appearances, beyond the seductive simplicity of youth, into the structures that govern behavior, society, and the self. Life experience gives the ability to sense motives, anticipate patterns, and respond not reactively, but with precision. This is not wisdom claimed from books. It is the deep embodied understanding that comes only from living fully, failing often, and surviving the trials that would have destroyed lesser selves. Integration of the shadow is the central work of the mature psyche. Few confront it, and fewer still emerge with the coherence that true self-mastery demands. The shadow is not merely the negative or socially unacceptable aspects of ourselves. It is every suppressed impulse, every unacknowledged desire, every moral and emotional contradiction that has been exiled from conscious awareness. To ignore it is to live in a house of mirrors, seeing only reflections of what the world allows, while the real architecture of the self crumbles in silence. Integration is not optional. It is the only path to depth, authority, and authentic freedom. The first confrontation with the shadow is rarely gentle. When individuals meet the parts of themselves they have denied, they feel rage, shame, and fear. These emotions are not obstacles, they are signals. Every defensive reaction is a signpost, pointing toward the exact aspect of the psyche that demands recognition. Those who evade this confrontation deceive themselves, constructing an identity of safety, morality, and social approval that is fragile because it rests on avoidance. The shadow waits patiently for decades, lurking in dreams, projections, and repeated life patterns, forcing recognition through pain and repeated failure until confrontation is unavoidable. Shadow integration is inherently an exercise in honesty. It demands that one acknowledge the instincts, desires, and traits that contradict the ego's self-image. A person who has cultivated a virtuous public persona, who prides themselves on morality, compassion, or competence, will find the shadow's voice insistent and disruptive. It exposes hypocrisy, reveals cowardice, and confronts the individual with the full spectrum of their humanity. This confrontation is often terrifying because it threatens the carefully curated image of the self. But it is precisely this threat that makes integration transformative. Superficial morality without self-awareness is fragile. Only by embracing contradiction can true authority over one's life emerge. The process also reveals the ways in which the shadow shapes behavior unconsciously. People act, react, and make decisions based on unacknowledged fears, unresolved anger, and suppressed desires. The over 5-0 individual who has begun integrating the shadow can perceive these forces at work in themselves and others, disentangling instinct from choice. This awareness does not eliminate instinct, it aligns it with conscious intent. Whereas youth often mistakes impulsivity for authenticity, mature integration allows instinct to serve wisdom rather than ego, desire, or social expectation. Integration also dismantles projection, one of the most insidious psychological traps. Humans have a persistent tendency to see in others the qualities they deny in themselves. Unacknowledged greed, envy, or cruelty is assumed to exist elsewhere, often in those closest to us. This projection distorts perception, fuels resentment, and sabotages relationships. By confronting the shadow, the mature individual learns to own these disowned traits, recognizing that the source of conflict is internal rather than external. Relationships, work, and social engagement become more authentic because the individual no longer unconsciously offloads inner chaos onto the world. The shadow also carries dormant potential. Every suppressed desire, every rejected instinct contains energy that, if integrated, can be transformed into creativity, resilience, and insight. The person who has lived decades without integration has often wasted vast reserves of psychic energy in repression, distraction, and self-deception. Integration, recycles this energy into life-affirming action. Ambition, courage, passion, and depth of perception emerge not from superficial discipline, but from the harnessing of what was once denied. In this sense, the shadow is not an enemy, but a reservoir of latent power that only experience and honesty can unlock. Importantly, shadow integration is cumulative over decades. It is rarely completed in a single confrontation or therapeutic encounter. Life after 50 provides repeated opportunities. Relationships fail, health challenges arise, ambitions falter, and unforeseen crises demand confrontation with the self. Each instance provides a mirror, a test, a stage on which hidden aspects of the psyche are revealed. The mature individual begins to anticipate these confrontations, cultivating humility, patience, and self-reflection that allow each encounter to deepen integration rather than shatter composure. Finally, integration transforms the structure of consciousness itself. It removes fragmentation, the hidden dissonances that sap energy and create inner conflict. Decisions are informed by totality, not by selective perception or ego preference. Emotional responses are tempered by awareness. The individual begins to move through life with coherence, authority, and a quiet but palpable presence. The power derived from shadow integration is subtle but unmistakable. It is felt in decision-making, in calm endurance, and in the ability to respond to chaos without succumbing to it. Detachment from external validation is one of the defining markers of true self-mastery. Most people live their lives as if their worth is measured by applause, recognition, or the perceived judgment of others. From youth, the psyche is trained to seek approval, to mold behavior, thoughts, and desires around what will be praised or tolerated. Careers are chosen not for authenticity, but for prestige. Relationships are maintained not for fulfillment, but for acceptance. Even moral choices are often dictated by the fear of social sanction rather than by an internal compass. This dependence on external validation subtly erodes autonomy, fragmenting the psyche and delaying the emergence of authentic authority. The problem is compounded by the fact that external validation is inherently unreliable. Approval is conditional, inconsistent, and often misaligned with reality. Praise today can turn to criticism tomorrow. Popularity is fleeting. Recognition rarely correlates with truth, skill, or moral depth. Those who tether their sense of self to such shifting criteria are condemned to a life of perpetual instability, emotionally reactive and psychologically vulnerable. Every decision is filtered through the gaze of imagined observers, every action moderated by the fear of disapproval, and every success hollowed by the realization that it is only meaningful insofar as it is witnessed and endorsed. Detachment from validation does not mean rejecting society, neglecting relationships, or abandoning morality. On the contrary, it requires confronting the ways in which one's dependence on approval has dictated choices, corrupted judgment, and obscured the self. The mature individual must recognize the subtle tyranny of applause, the internalized voice of parents, peers, institutions, and culture that continuously evaluates, rewards, or punishes behavior. Only by consciously observing these influences and tracing their effects can one begin to separate authentic desire from conditioned response. This detachment is born of experience and necessity. Life after 50, especially for those who have endured repeated failures, betrayals, and losses, gradually exposes the futility of seeking validation as a life strategy. By midlife, many have faced the collapse of relationships, careers, or social standing. They have encountered the truth that others cannot and will not provide the affirmation needed to sustain a stable identity. The realization is harsh but liberating. The psyche must learn to stand alone, to define its own standards, and to measure its own worth. External applause becomes irrelevant because the individual has cultivated an internal metric of success and integrity that is far more precise and resilient. Detachment also reshapes relationships. The person who no longer requires validation moves through interactions with clarity rather than manipulation. They do not flatter, perform, or adjust themselves to gain approval. Instead, they act with integrity, guided by a deeper sense of necessity and truth. This does not guarantee acceptance. It often results in conflict, rejection, or isolation. But the mature psyche values authenticity over comfort, coherence over popularity, and long-term alignment over immediate reward. In this way, detachment produces not cynicism, but a refined capacity for discernment, the ability to engage with the world on one's own terms, free from the distortions of fear, desire, or ego-driven projection. The process is often gradual, marked by painful discoveries. Those who have relied on external validation for decades must confront the discomfort of self-sufficiency. Emotional reactions that were once mitigated by praise, applause, or recognition now arise without an external mirror. Anxiety, self-doubt, and insecurity must be faced directly, not displaced onto others. The over 5-0 individual has usually accumulated enough experience to navigate these challenges with patience, awareness, and strategic reflection. They understand that autonomy is not absence of vulnerability. It is the ability to act and decide despite vulnerability. Detachment from validation also liberates creative and intellectual energy. When the mind is no longer preoccupied with pleasing, persuading, or performing, attention can turn inward toward exploration, insight, and mastery. Work becomes an expression of competence, thought, and skill rather than a performance for others. Decisions are made according to principle rather than popularity. Even pleasure becomes self-directed, chosen for intrinsic satisfaction rather than social approval. In this sense, detachment is not austerity, it is liberation, a redirection of psychic energy from superficial reward to authentic engagement. Finally, this detachment strengthens resilience. When the psyche is untethered from approval, it cannot be manipulated or destabilized by the judgments of others. Criticism no longer wounds deeply. Praise no longer inflates ego destructively. The over 5-0 individual learns to endure disapproval, indifference, and even hostility without losing coherence or integrity. Detachment from external validation is not arrogance. It is armor forged through decades of experience, reflection, and confrontation with the illusions of social reward. It is a prerequisite for autonomy, clarity, and true authority of the self. The discipline of repetition and reflection is the engine of true self-mastery, the relentless mechanism by which the psyche is tempered and refined over decades. Few recognize its necessity. Youth prizes novelty, excitement, and rapid gratification. Mistakes are fleeting, and lessons are often ignored because the mind craves new experiences rather than revisiting old wounds. But the mature individual learns that mastery is not sudden. It is cumulative, built through sustained engagement with recurring challenges and persistent introspection. Every repetition exposes patterns, every reflection clarifies meaning, and over time, the combination transforms behavior, judgment, and consciousness. Repetition is rarely glamorous. It often involves returning to the same problems, confronting the same weaknesses, and navigating the same emotional traps that have caused pain in the past. The mind resists it because repetition is tedious, uncomfortable, and unglamorous. Yet this is precisely why it is necessary. Growth is not instantaneous. It is iterative. Each encounter with failure, temptation, or moral ambiguity is an opportunity to refine response, to adjust perception, and to internalize lessons that were missed the first time. The over 5-0 individual, who has survived repeated cycles of difficulty, understands that mastery emerges not in moments of brilliance, but in the steady refinement of habitual response. Reflection complements repetition. Without reflection, repetition is mechanical, unconscious, and ultimately wasted. Reflection requires the courage to confront what has been repeated, to see patterns without flinching, and to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about oneself. It is a process of mapping the psyche, tracing the invisible lines between desire, action, consequence, and belief. This mapping exposes unconscious habits, hidden fears, and moral contradictions that continue to influence decisions in subtle ways. Only through deliberate reflection can repetition become conscious practice, transforming raw experience into disciplined insight. The discipline of repetition and reflection is also a confrontation with ego. Humans are naturally resistant to revisiting failure, disappointment, or moral failure, because these experiences threaten the self-image. Reflection demands honesty, a willingness to admit mistakes, recognize weakness, and confront the ways one has deceived oneself or others. It is not a comforting exercise. It is a rigorous, sometimes brutal audit of the self. Those who evade it maintain illusions of progress, but without repeated, reflective engagement, the psyche remains fragmented, reactive, and vulnerable to recurring patterns of dysfunction. Time amplifies the effect of this discipline. In youth, the consequences of failure may be reversible. The mind may ignore lessons without catastrophic cost. By midlife, repeated cycles of repetition and reflection have cumulative weight. Patterns are no longer theoretical. Their impact is measurable in relationships, health, career, and personal integrity. The over 50 individual who has engaged in disciplined reflection recognizes recurring errors, anticipates potential pitfalls, and acts preemptively. The mind becomes a finely tuned instrument, calibrated by decades of iterative practice, capable of subtle discernment and measured response. Repetition and reflection also cultivate patience. Mastery is rarely visible from the outside because it grows slowly, almost imperceptibly. It is easy to mistake surface accomplishments for progress, to equate action with mastery. True authority of self, however, is built in the small, repeated choices. The decision to respond calmly rather than react impulsively. The willingness to revisit a lesson until it is fully integrated. The discipline to endure discomfort for the sake of clarity. Over decades, these repeated exercises of attention, judgment, and moral courage accumulate into a coherent, resilient, and autonomous psyche. Furthermore, this discipline strengthens resilience in the face of unpredictability. Life is not linear. Circumstances, people, and opportunities are constantly shifting. The individual who has cultivated the habit of repetition and reflection can navigate novelty with composure, recognizing familiar patterns beneath apparent chaos. Emotional turbulence is met with tempered awareness rather than panic. Decisions are informed by both precedent and insight rather than impulse or fear. The psyche becomes a vessel capable of absorbing shock, learning from it, and responding with precision. Finally, repetition and reflection illuminate the depth of the self. Surface identity, social roles, and habitual behaviors obscure the full spectrum of the psyche. Repeated confrontation with the same challenges and persistent self-examination gradually reveal the hidden structures, latent capacities, and moral architecture that define authentic selfhood. Over decades, the individual learns not only what they do and why, but also what they are capable of becoming. Mastery is not a title or a stage. It is a continuous process of refinement and unending engagement with life itself through disciplined practice and reflective awareness. The emergence of wisdom over impulse is the hallmark of mature self-mastery. In youth, life is often dominated by raw energy, ambition, and reactive behavior. Decisions are guided by desire, fear, and immediate gratification rather than by deliberation or understanding. Impulses drive action, and the consequences of those actions are frequently ignored or underestimated. The psyche is untempered, reactive, and fragile, easily swayed by circumstance, emotion, or social influence. Only through decades of confrontation with the self, repeated mistakes, and careful reflection does the capacity for wisdom emerge, an ability to act intentionally, measured by insight rather than instinct, and informed by experience rather than novelty. Wisdom is not the absence of impulse. It is the capacity to recognize, evaluate, and direct it. Every human carries within them instincts, desires, and reactive tendencies. Youthful exuberance mistakes these forces for authenticity, often confusing impulsive action with courage, creativity, or moral correctness. Over time, however, the repeated experience of consequence teaches restraint. The individual discovers that unexamined impulses lead to predictable suffering, broken relationships, wasted effort, and self-inflicted regret. Wisdom arises when these impulses are not suppressed through denial, but are instead observed, understood, and redirected. The mature mind no longer simply reacts. It perceives the full spectrum of potential outcomes and chooses action aligned with long-term integrity. The process of developing wisdom over impulse is cumulative and iterative. Every failed decision, every moment of regret, and every encounter with one's own limitations functions as a corrective lens, sharpening perception and judgment. Youth often misinterprets repetition as failure or stagnation, but in reality, the repetition of mistakes provides the material from which discernment is forged. By midlife, the individual has experienced sufficient cycles of desire, action, and consequence to recognize patterns, anticipate consequences, and respond with measured thought rather than reflex. Impulses are no longer master. They become resources, harnessed to serve conscious intention rather than unconscious habit. Crucially, this emergence requires honesty with oneself. Wisdom cannot coexist with self-deception, denial, or moral pretense. The mature individual must confront uncomfortable truths, the shadow of envy, rage, greed, or cowardice that has influenced behavior for decades. Impulses, once unexamined, reveal the hidden architecture of the psyche. To gain mastery, one must trace the source of reactive tendencies, understand their triggers, and accept responsibility for the choices they produce. This level of awareness does not come from reading, theory, or observation. It comes exclusively from experience and reflection over time. The maturation from impulse to wisdom also transforms emotional life. Younger individuals are often swept away by passion, excitement, or frustration, allowing transient emotions to dictate actions and decisions. Over decades, repeated engagement with consequence teaches regulation without repression. The over 5-0 individual develops the ability to feel fully, yet act deliberately. Anger, desire, and fear remain present but no longer dictate behavior. Emotional intensity is tempered by reflective judgment. Actions are not inhibited by fear or desire, but neither are they impulsive. Each choice is deliberate, measured, and informed by accumulated insight. This transformation has profound social and relational implications. Impulsivity often alienates, disrupts, or damages connections. Wisdom, by contrast, cultivates respect, trust, and influence. Decisions guided by insight rather than reaction produce stability in relationships, reliability in collaboration, and moral authority in leadership. Others sense the difference. One who acts from wisdom is not merely experienced, but carries a presence shaped by intentionality and equilibrium. Impulse yields volatility. Wisdom yields coherence. The emergence of wisdom over impulse is also inseparable from temporal perspective. The over 5-0 individual understands that life is finite and that actions have long-term implications. Decisions are measured not by immediate reward or recognition, but by enduring consequence. This perspective diminishes trivial desires and amplifies discernment. Impulse may still arise, but it is now filtered through layers of reflection, ethical awareness, and experiential knowledge. Patience becomes possible because the psyche recognizes the weight of time, the recurrence of patterns, and the inevitability of consequence. Finally, wisdom over impulse transforms the very nature of power within the self. True authority is not demonstrated through domination, speed, or assertiveness, but through calm deliberation, foresight, and strategic alignment with reality. Impulsive action may impress, provoke, or intimidate, but it is always temporary and brittle. Wisdom produces influence that is enduring, decisions that are resilient, and actions that are congruent with the deepest truths of the individual's psyche. The over 5-0 consciousness, shaped by decades of repetition, reflection, confrontation with the shadow, and detachment from validation, wields this wisdom not as a show of strength, but as the natural outcome of disciplined life experience.